Good morning, everybody. My name's Jeff Golliher. I'm the assisting minister provincial for sacred ecology in the province of Americas. And I just want to thank you right at the very beginning for inviting me to speak to your meeting. I'm very grateful for that. And it's very nice to be here. I want to also kind of give an apology because I can't be with you in person. But where I'm sitting right now is in the sanctuary of my parish church in the upstate part of New York, and I'm in the middle of a kind of a transition now, so that sometime in the spring, after Christmas or in the spring, I'll be retired from my work as a parish priest. But that is a lot of hard work to do. The diocese is helping a lot, but so it's all good, but it's taking a whole lot of my time and energy right now. I'm not retiring from working with Franciscans and being Franciscan, so I hope to be doing even more of that later. So what I want to talk about today is the overall theme is listening to Mother Earth, and I want to focus in doing that. I want to weave together to share my thoughts and experience with you about that and what it means, and I'll sort of focus on what that means in terms of deepening what I understand to be as deepening and strengthening our order in order to meet the challenges that we're facing today and those that are coming. How that relates to discernment, and then how all that relates to eco-justice, which is, I think, a sort of a common shared way of putting it. But in terms of the spiritual, the contemplative, the community action, ethical justice issues that we face today, it's hugely important for us now to begin to weave together all the different strands that we need to take into account. And so that's what I want to share with you today, is my thoughts about that. Apology again for not being able to be there. But the transition, that I'm facing here as a parish priest is that what we're all sharing in all the different parts of our order, throughout the world, that we're all sharing a different kind of larger, hugely significant transition now. And it has to do with Mother Earth, and it has to do with us and how we understand what effective action might be like, or working through the kinds of grief and frustration and anger sometimes that people are feeling about this larger transition. And that has to do, of course, with our climate and ecological emergency that we're facing globally. I'll say a little bit about that. I think most of you probably know that climatologists say that July has been the hottest month in human history. Also, a couple days ago, the climatologists and the UN agencies in the UN also reported that so far this year we've reached the 1.5 C centigrade degree threshold already. By that I mean, you might remember that back at the Paris Agreement at the climate meeting in 2015, that the global agreement was that we would cut our greenhouse emissions by half by 2030 in order to keep the rate of heating to be no greater than 1.5 degrees, that we would need to cut our emissions by half by 2030 and reduce them to zero by about 2045. So 1.5 was one of the hotly debated, to to say the least, issues about at the UN climate meetings over the years. But my point is that we are now facing yet a stronger and more urgent wake-up call, because we've apparently reached the 1.5. We're beginning to reach the 1.5 threshold sooner than scientists had thought we would. I mean, this was seen as a possibility, but 2023 is a little soon. So the same kind of urgency and the same kind of issues around changes in Mother Earth, in our biosphere, for example, in the oceans, the poles, the rates of deforestation, not only greenhouse gas emissions, but that included. All of those are changes that are destructive, are happening quicker than we had thought 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I want to say, though, about that, so the truth is that back in the 90s, and there was another climatologist named James Hansen who worked for NASA, National Aeronautic and Space Administration here in the U.S. His office is in New York at Columbia. I had known James Hansen, but the reason is in part because his office was right across the street from the cathedral where I worked, and I knew did spiritual direction with a lot of his staff and knew them well. But he had said back before most of the large climate meetings began, he had said that we would really need to keep the rate of increase to only 1.1 degree above pre-industrial levels. And then when the climate meetings started, the negotiations didn't go that way, and they raised it to 1.5. It was at another time, people were even thinking about making it 2.0. I was at the 2009, just to share some history about this. I was in Copenhagen in 2009. I was at that climate conference in Copenhagen, and this was one of the first meetings where this was really, really seriously being debated. And at the time, the thought was that we would make that threshold to be 2.0 degrees rather than 1.5 or 1.1. And in Copenhagen, they did agree to 2.0, but there was a huge amount of protest. I don't think that was widely reported. I was there. I was part of the protest. Desmond Tutu was there, and he was actually helping to lead and organize a lot of the protest outside of the big, kind of arena where the meeting was happening. And then it ended up being several years later that the UN climate process shifted gears and made it more reasonable to 1.5. But all along, and I don't think this is obvious, but all along, one of the forces that's been exerting a huge amount of influence on these climate talks behind the scenes has been actually the corporations, and the fossil fuel industry themselves. This hasn't been widely reported, but it has been known. And that's one of the reasons that Bishop Tutu was there in 2009. I remember I was with him one day, and as the negotiations were happening inside the building, we walked up to a door toward the back, and he walked up the door and was beating on the door with his bishop's stick, if I remember right, and bishop's staff, and was, like, let us in, let us in. Meaning he was making the point that the negotiations were being kind of subverted and by the powers that be in the world. I just want to make the point also that a lot of times people complain about the United Nations. The problem is that the United Nations itself is not, especially around the climate and ecology, eco-justice talks. What's going on behind the scenes is that the global corporations are very, very sophisticated and knowledgeable about how to subvert and sometimes undermine the goals that we need to reach. I'll return about that a little bit later, but I wanted to go ahead and say it now, because it has to do with this. It has to do with discernment, and it has to do with why and how we need to deepen and strengthen our order around discernment, and what that might suggest to us about how we think about how to be Franciscan in the years ahead. Okay, so we're facing the wake-up call now is as loud as it has ever been. It will probably get louder. And about that too, the indigenous voices are voices about this that we really need to listen to more closely. We have been, and we're getting better at doing that. But it was an indigenous writer named Natalie Diaz who said that, she put it very simply, but she said, the earth is exhausted and the earth is now trying to cleanse herself. And a lot of what we're seeing, the way she would understand it is that, for example, the fires in Hawaii and Maui just a few days ago, and in Canada, what we're seeing around droughts and heat and temperatures and people suffering, the extinction rates, of species around the planet are astonishing. I don't think this has been this way for several years, and I don't think the public is aware of it, even though it appears in the news sometimes, but the number of insect species, for example, that are going extinct is like 40%. The number of just animals, I don't mean species, but animals, if you were to count the number of animals across the planet, just the numbers have decreased by 40%. I mean, it's like the number of living creatures is reducing drastically. And the reason is because our ecosystem, the web of life, is becoming gradually sort of unraveling the different strands that make the web of life into a living whole, that make it possible for life to exist, for human life to exist, is the different strands are being pulled apart gradually. And Mother Earth, what Natalie Diaz is saying is that Mother Earth is trying to weave it back together. And we need to help and understand what's going on and why, and what our role has been as both a destructive agent and what it might be better as a source of healing and justice and healing for Mother Earth and ourselves and our brothers and sisters. That's what this wake-up call about, and that's why this last month of July and this year of reaching that 1.5 above industrial level threshold of temperature is, is so important. So, I've said that as a kind of a introduction, but my purpose here is going to be to today in this session is to focus on the idea of unthinkable. How can we help each other in our communities, even not just in our order, but in our communities and organizations and so on, to learn to kind of move through what seems to be unthinkable so that we are able to actually discern in a way that is helpful. And then I want to put that in the context of the Franciscan conversion of life. The conversion of life, our charism, penitence, and that means for us in a lot of ways, a conversion of life, is at the heart of what it is that we're facing today, what humanity is facing today. And it's always been, like from Mother Earth's point of view, that charism is, like the source of life. It's reflecting the source of life itself and its sacredness and its goodness. And we need to help people understand what that means and how that has, in fact, been part of our religious tradition, for centuries, and longer, too. Okay, and then in the next presentation, which I'll talk for a while now, and then there'll be the second one, I want to focus then, bring all this down to three kind of basic questions that that will help us, I believe, to deepen and strengthen our lives together as Franciscans and in terms of the web of life. Three basic questions that will help with discernment, and those are, do we know where we live and what that means? Number two, what do we see? And that question comes from the prophet Amos. That's the question that he asks of people. It's about discernment. What do you see? What do we think we're seeing, and what does it mean? And then the last question, of course, is who are our neighbors? Who are our neighbors? That's been at the heart of the Christian mission, since the time of Jesus. So, just to share a little bit about my background before we get into the heart of it, is I want to just mention a few things. I've been encouraged to do this. I don't usually, but I will today, is that there are different kind of pivotal moments in my life, things that I've done that are helping me to see things the way that I do now, especially as a Franciscan. Things that helped me to become a Franciscan in the first place, actually. But the first one was, one of the first was when I was 18 years old. I was very fortunate, 19. I had just gone to college, and that summer, one of the professors I knew was very kindly and courageously, I should say, too, took me to the Talamanca rainforest in Costa Rica. It's a very isolated and remote rainforest area where the Bribri and the Quebeca live. And during those, I went several times after that, but I got to know one of the healers and kind of ritual singers, who was older at the time, and he kind of took me under his wings in the time that I was there. But what I want to say about that is that what I learned, what he taught me and how he taught me, was that he insisted that we really didn't talk very much. And so when I would try to engage him or to learn the language, even in that, he was not interested in that. He wanted me to just be with him in silence, so that and he was encouraging in me, for deeply spiritual reasons that I didn't understand at the time, really, that to cultivate inner silence within myself, meaning to kind of stop talking to myself so much. He could have been saying that to any of us. But that is part of, I later understood that was part of the door that Jesus referred to about himself. I'm the gate, I'm the door. Second thing is, when I later was in graduate school, I studied I was interested in the study of meaning, especially. And I studied with people who had been Nazi resistors during the 1930s and had been involved with trying to decode the propaganda that was going around, not unlike today in terms of the rise of authoritarian governments, and a new kind of modern version, as it were, of fascism that's developing. And they later became linguists and left, and they fled Europe, during those years, and got major teaching jobs here. And it was very helpful for me to study with them, because a lot of the issues that we're facing today around colonization and decolonization require that we have a deeper level of discernment than we are encouraged to have because we're being colonized. What's happening in the world today is a new form of colonization. Colonization is not just a thing of the past. And so a lot of what I say today is coming from what I learned from them. I spent a summer with Paulo Freire, the liberation theologian in Brazil. Very helpful for the same reasons, actually. And then later, after I was ordained, but working at the Cathedral in St. John the Divine in the city and for the communion. I actually worked also for the United Nations environment program, and development program too. They asked me to be part of a team of people, maybe 10 or so, working with an anthropologist named Daryl Posey, who was winner of the Chico Mendes Award in Brazil. And he headed the team, and we wrote the vision statement, which was actually quite long. It involved a lot of input from different kinds of people. It's a collection of different perspectives called Cultural and Spiritual Values of Biodiversity. And that he had a big influence on on even the things that I say today. And then working for the Anglican Communion too was, and working with many of the different provinces and seeing how important awareness of the diversity within our communion is. That our diversity is a huge part of the strength of our church. It's not a problem. It's the strength. Last thing is that I was given a talk at a UNESCO meeting in Rome. This was probably 20 years ago or more, and went to Assisi. And I have never been to Assisi before, so it was a week-long meeting, and so I got on a bus and went to Assisi and spent, it was in the middle of winter, and there was like no one in the basilica, and I was able to go there and do that silent prayer, and it was an experience, I won't go into the details, that was part of my conversion of life. And so anyway, that's how we got here today. All right, moving ahead, about our wake-up call, where we are now. There was another person named René Dubose who worked at the UN in the 70s and 80s, or helped to form the UN's work. And he loved St. Francis. And he's the person who, think globally, act locally. Remember hearing that? That came from René Dubose. And also the two words, sacred ecology. And I'm bringing him up because he was the person that really, that his work shaped this whole global effort that we have today that the UN is organizing around environment, eco-justice, sustainable development, human rights. And he understood back then, he didn't necessarily use this word like it's used recently, but he said this is going to be unthinkable for people, that where we are headed is the consequences are so serious that people are just not going to believe it. Or it's not just that exactly, but they're not going to know how to think about it. And for one example, is how it is that we kind of trick ourselves into drawing the wrong conclusions. For example, in English, the word environment, for example, common word. Nothing wrong with the word in a lot of ways, but the way we put it to use is the problem, and that the assumption in the way that it's commonly used. Now, I don't mean what the dictionary says, but in the way we actually use the language, is that the environment is something kind of separate from us. Now, we've heard this many times, but the significance of that goes deeper than we realize. But the environment is not my surroundings. And it's key, and this is what Dubose was trying to get across in using the word sacred ecology, or using St. Francis of Assisi as an example of someone who did understand. But our relationships we are part of. It's not either or. It's part of. Environment is not out there separate from us or me. Never is, never will be, and that is a trick of the mind that is part of the colonial process, actually, to convince people that what's out there is there to be exploited, that it's not actually part of you, but it's to be exploited, used, made profit from, is sort of part of the greed cycle. And that's one of the reasons, that is still one of the reasons that we are, the public across the world is so easily fooled into thinking that we are doing enough now in terms of the emergency that we're facing. It's like it's just a delaying tactic. Well, that's the problem. It's out there. It's not within here. It's out there. It's not part of our life together. And DeBose thought, like Francis would have thought too, was that unless we have the kind of conversion of life within us, then that's where the problem is. How we got into this mess in the first place, and the conversion that needs to happen, that will help us learn how to listen to Mother Earth again, has to come from within here and from within our life together. Okay, so in terms of the unthinkable part of this, I want to focus on that a little bit too. In this session, there was a writer in the last few years named David Wallace Wells. He's an environmental journalist. Wasn't trained as a scientist, but has a very adept way of understanding these things. But he wrote a book called Our Uninhabitable Earth, and it became very controversial, at least in the Western world, I guess, because he made the claim that unless we take effective action, like now, that the Earth could become uninhabitable for human beings within a century, and a lot of scientists, raised an alarm about that because they said, no, it's not that fast. Others said, well, maybe it is that fast, and so on. And whether or not Wells is right about how soon or how much time we've got, as put it that way, in terms of discernment, the more important thing that he wrote was that how unthinkable all of this is for people. He's not just talking about he doesn't mean scientists who are better able or Franciscans who might be better able to, but he means just for humanity. And that was a really good point, because it's not pointing to the question, am I right and you're wrong about anything, one thing or another, but he's pointing to the challenge that we're facing within our souls about how to live in God's creation in a respectful, life-affirming way, and how to have honest conversation with each other rather than us in all the different cultures that we're part of or we're representing in this meeting. There's a lot of diversity. Diversity is good, but we all have a tendency to think that that we're the center of the universe and that other people aren't, or how that goes, or to think that other people, I'm more right than someone else, or whatever. Ego inflation, put it in terms of psychology. Anthropologists call it ethnocentrism, thinking that the center of the world are with my people, whatever that may mean. The reason that I really liked that Wallace Wells made that comment about the unthinkability of it all, because it was pointing directly to the kind of conversion of life that we need so that we can be open enough to see through our blinders, to engage the kinds of issues that our survival depends on right now. I mean, in a manner of speaking, it brings us back to, very kind of traditional concepts in religion generally, all religions. In the church, we call that discernment. In our order, penitence. And for us, which, kind of broadly means the conversion of life. And what did that mean for St. Francis of Assisi? What did the discernment, what happened within him that made it possible for him to begin to think the unthinkable. That's really, really what it meant. And then what impact did that have on his life and how he lived? I mean, that was the beginning of our order. And we're living at a time when so much of humanity is facing a situation that seems unthinkable, or people beginning to realize I think the majority of people in the world are actually beginning to realize that there's something real, very dangerous that's going on, possibly catastrophic. But we haven't moved yet into understanding that may be becoming thinkable. But then the other part of the unthinkable is, what role do I have? What is my responsibility for all this? For real. I mean, I don't mean just in the abstract, like I'm reading a newspaper article, but I mean within my heart and soul. Who am I? How can I have families and communities and a congregation and so on, so that we begin to step out of the darkness and into the light of the truth about these things. Remember Thomas Merton writing in the 1970s, I guess it was. He wrote a book called The Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. Very prescient kind of book. But he was, even back then, before there was really much knowledge about the global emergency we're facing, was seeing it too. I want to read you something that he wrote in that book. But it has to do with like clearing our mind of the shadowy stuff, so that we can learn how to think and think more clearly and be honest with each other. He says, the greatest need of our time is to clean out this enormous mass of mental and emotional rubbish that clutters our minds and makes of all political and social life a mass illness. Without this house cleaning, we cannot begin to see. And unless we see, we cannot think. That was before my time slightly, but Merton, I always loved Thomas Merton, but he had a way of putting things that was just exactly right. And those words are as important, even more important today than they were when he wrote them. It's because the consequences have become so much, the consequences of what he was getting at have become so much more, sort of obvious and kind of threatening. I think I want to close this session with one last kind of reflection, and that has to do with conversion of life as it relates to everything that I've been sharing with you this morning. One of the concerns that René Dubos, the French philosopher that I mentioned earlier, one of the concerns that he had back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s especially, was that the likely response, politically speaking, to what is now, the emergency that was back in his time was a possibility, now is real. He was concerned that the likely political response was going to be a kind of eco-fascism that's tied to the authoritarian governments that we see that are rising up in many places today. And the assumption behind that is that what will happen, what is likely to happen in many parts of the world, is that people will become prey to fear, and people who are selling fear to the public for the purpose of gaining more power and wealth. The same thing kind of happened with the Nazis in the 1930s, when people may not know this, but a large part of their, kind of propaganda was seen at the time as kind of green where the motherland and preserving the motherland, meaning my home is, important, Eden-like, God-like, and other people's homes out there can be and should be sacrificed in order to preserve mine. That's what ecofascism amounts to, and it's tied through the course of history. It's tied to racism, is what happened to indigenous peoples and so on at the hands of Western genocide. But that it's probably a good time for us as Franciscans then to ask how it is that we, as a global order, can be more effective and more organized and maybe more thoughtful about how it is that we make public statements about the state of the planet and the state of humanity, refugees, for example, and so on. One of the issues in the past it's my understanding is that one of the difficulties for us, understandably, in the past, was that it's hard to talk about that because of the diversity of our order. What might seem like in one part of the communion or our order, what might seem like effective action there could be actually kind of destructive in its implications for somewhere else, for in the Pacific maybe or in Africa. But it seems to me that we've reached a time now in our common life, in our life together in humanity with Mother Earth, that we need to find ways to talk maybe on a different level. I'm not sure what that looks like, but where we're speaking with one voice that is also reflecting a diversity of voices who are also speaking together, and overcome this us versus them kind of trickery that is so much of authoritarian propaganda is based on, which is is us versus them. And we need to help people overcome that by raising the greatness of our own and richness of our own diversity, and showing how that is one call to all of humanity. So I think I'll stop there, but in the next session, I want to talk about those three questions to bring this into a practical focus about how to begin to talk about this complicated, complex, kind of scary kind of situation that we're in, but how to talk about it in our fellowships, in our communities, and so on, by focusing on three questions, and that is, do we know where we live? What do we see? Amos the prophet, and who are our neighbors? And in that way, our, charism, our conversion of life charism, can help us be really effective, spirit-filled weavers who are weaving the web of life back together. Anyway, that's all for now. I'll see you soon. Thanks.